Our next speaker is Professor Andre Fleche. Am I saying that right, Andre?
Yep, perfect.
Professor Fleche teaches at Castleton College, formerly known as Castleton State College, in Castleton, Vermont. And Professor Fleche is here in part because when I started this quest, I called upon Gary Gallagher, who's the most distinguished professor of Civil War history in the country. And he's a professor at the University of Virginia. And he said, I would like to come, but I have another conflict. But besides, you have a historian in Vermont who can do this job as well as I, and it's Professor Fleche. And it turns out that Professor Fleche got his doctorate at the University of Virginia, studying under the now professor of history at the University of Virginia, Professor Gallagher. Professor Fleche lives in Rutland on a very historic street, Crescent Street, near the residence of Jim Jeffords and General Wing. And we're just so grateful to have you here and look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, and thanks, Tom, for that introduction, and thanks for having me down here, and thank you all for coming on this lovely Memorial Day Sunday. I know I'm up against Howard Coffin, so I really appreciate that you're here, but I'm glad you stuck around because it's a really great time right now to be talking about the Civil War. I think any time's a good time to talk about the Civil War, since I devoted my life to it, but today's a particularly good occasion. First of all, we're observing Memorial Day, which is a holiday that originated with the Civil War. In the years after the war, impromptu groups of Union veterans would go down to cemeteries in the springtime to decorate the graves of the fallen. And in the late 1860s, General John Logan, who at that time was commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, the main veterans union organization, issued general orders that all the decoration days, as they were called, would be consolidated on one holiday towards the end of May. So those are the origins of Memorial Day as we know it. Secondly, we are this month marking the end of the sesquicentennial of the war. Actually, this coming Tuesday, May 26th, marked the surrender of Edmund Kirby Smith's Trans-Mississippi Command, which was the last large organized Confederate army to surrender, effectively ending the war, although there would be surrenders throughout 1865, including a Confederate commerce raider in November. But as far as active field armies in the United States this coming week will end the sesquicentennial. So I'm really happy that we're having this event to honor the sesquicentennial and talk about the issues of the war that remain relevant today. I think issues of race in America, political disagreement in America. A lot of people in the Civil War community have talked about the fact that this sesquicentennial hasn't gotten as much attention, say, as the centennial did back in the 1960s. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but one that I'm convinced of is that when our country is dealing with difficult times, people don't like to be reminded of an era in which political disagreement, political divisions tore the country in two and caused America's bloodiest war, well more than 700,000 deaths. But I do think that it's important that we remember the war for the reasons that I just suggested. Well, my topic for today is abolitionism in Vermont, and I'm not going to narrate the history of abolitionism in Vermont because I assume many of you are somewhat familiar with that topic, and indeed probably some of you know more about the local history than I do. I'm sure that you're aware of the high points. If you're not, I'll just point out a few. First of all, as probably as many of you know, Vermonters adopted the first abolition law in the Western Hemisphere when the 1777 Constitution outlawed adult slavery in, well, then the Republic, not yet state of Vermont. So Vermonters in many ways were leaders on the slavery issue and the issue of abolition from the beginning. As you probably know, many prominent abolitionists either grew up in Vermont or spent significant time in Vermont. William Lloyd Garrison, for example, who popularized immediate abolitionism in the 1830s, got his start in journalism in 1828 in Bennington, publishing a newspaper there briefly before moving on to Boston. And just about the same time, Horace Greeley, the famous Yankee Republican reformer who would go on to edit and publish what was at the time the nation's most popular newspaper, the New York Tribune, was publishing a paper in Poultney, Vermont, and experimenting with the reform ideas that he would popularize in the 1840s and the 1850s. Thaddeus Stevens, right, the radical Republican who was instrumental in pushing for the 13th Amendment ending slavery and the 14th Amendment establishing citizenship, grew up in Danville and Peacham up near St. Johnsbury before moving on to Pennsylvania, where he made his fortune. And of course you probably know that countless ordinary Vermonters helped in many ways lead the anti-slavery movement in the years before the Civil War. Vermont was very much involved in the petition campaign of the 1830s, in which average Vermonters sent petitions to their congressmen asking that the abolition of slavery be discussed on the House floor. Interestingly enough, men and women very much involved in that effort. In Vermont, it was abolitionism, a movement that appealed to both men and women. And as you might know, that petition campaign resulted in the infamous gag rule by which Congress agreed not to hear the petitions, which alarmed many Vermonters and other Northerners about threats to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. You probably know, of course, that Vermonters were especially active in resisting the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Participating in the Underground Railroad and assisting fugitive slaves. So I assume that you're familiar with some of those aspects of Vermont's abolitionist past, and there's certainly no doubt that Vermont played a very big role in coming to grips with the issues that caused the war, as well as steering the war in an abolitionist direction. But abolitionism really is a complicated topic to discuss, and what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about some of the myths that have been challenged in some of the recent scholarship that's come out about Vermont and about abolitionism, and complicate this idea of Vermont as an abolitionist state. Because I said abolitionism is a complicated topic. First of all, as we'll see, what we define as abolitionism was never a majority position in the North, and probably wasn't a majority position in Vermont either. When the war broke out, as you probably know, the main question on most Americans' minds was union versus disunion, not necessarily slavery versus freedom, although plenty of committed activists wish that the latter question would have been at the forefront. The main myth that I want to challenge is that the Civil War kind of pitted this monolithic anti-slavery North against a pro-slavery South, and point out that there are all kinds of gradation in opinion, both in the North, in Vermont, and throughout the country. The truth is that even in Vermont, right, the politics of anti-slavery were controversial and contested. Now that's not to diminish Vermont's abolitionist heritage. You know, that's not my intention. My intention is to complicate it and point out that you know, even in their home states, you know, Vermont abolitionists had an uphill battle in winning public opinion over to their side. And so in many ways, it makes the accomplishments of Vermont's abolitionists all the more impressive. You know, that not all Vermonters walked in lockstep in the realm of anti-slavery politics. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the themes that have come up in recent scholarship, and you know, hopefully we'll have some time to have a dialogue, you know, ask questions, and talk about these issues. All right, so you know, the first myth or misconception that I'd like to address is one that portrays anti-slavery politics as a monolithic movement. You know, in other words, a position that all anti-slavery activists agreed upon. And in order to do that, I just want to establish some vocabulary and some terms that will be important throughout the rest of the lecture. The fact of the matter is that, you know, even within anti-slavery ranks in the antebellum era, there's a wide gradation of opinions. Right? Anti-slavery activists disagreed with each other, and plenty of Northerners disagreed with anti-slavery activists. The first, you know, anti-slavery activists to win widespread support, both in Vermont and throughout the country, are what historians term colonizationists. All right? So the colonizationists hoped to gradually end slavery, mostly by transporting slaves or ex-slaves out of the country. Returning them to settlements in Africa was the idea. As you can imagine, this brand of anti-slavery politics appealed to white Americans with a variety of opinions. Right? Some colonizationists wished to end slavery by any means. You know, they truly were committed to, you know, a humanitarian end to slavery. But others who joined the colonizationist movement were more disturbed by the presence of African Americans in American life. That, you know, it wasn't so much that slavery is an institution bothered them. They perceived that the presence of African Americans in the United States created a race problem that could only be resolved through colonization or, you know, transportation of African Americans out of the country. So, you know, interestingly enough, in the early 1800s, even in the southern states, there were plenty of whites who supported colonization, right, as an alternative to slavery. And Vermont was certainly at the forefront of this effort. In 1818, a group of Vermonters established the first state colonization society in the United States. They met as a private group up in the State House in Montpelier and launched this Vermont Colonization Society, which did have attract quite a bit of support and have quite a bit of success over the course of the 1820s, 1830s, even into the 40s and 50s. You know, by the 1850s, it's estimated that Vermont supporters of colonization had raised funds to transport at least 600 African Americans to Liberia, which of course was the state that was established by this colonization movement. So even in the early 1800s, right, abolitionism, or excuse me, not abolition, colonizationist anti-slavery was quite popular in Vermont as well as the rest of the country. By the 1830s, though, the work of the colonizationists was beginning to be challenged by other anti-slavery activists, most notably by the people that we term abolitionists proper. Right? So when we use that term abolitionist, we talk about a very specific political position that really begins to emerge in the 1830s. Abolitionists called for the immediate end of slavery more or less on humanitarian grounds, because slavery was an evil and it was wrong. Generally, abolitionists had abandoned the idea of colonization, which of course attracted more African Americans. Certainly would have been attracted to the abolitionist ranks because there wasn't the assumption that African Americans would need to leave the country. Now, abolitionists were divided to a certain extent on just how many rights African Americans should enjoy, but they certainly agreed that slavery should end immediately and that colonization wouldn't necessarily be part of the plan. The most famous abolitionist, right, as I'm using the term, of course, was William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the first major widespread anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston in 1831. But as I mentioned earlier, before that, he'd spent some time in Vermont. In 1828, Garrison had come to Bennington to publish a newspaper in support of John Quincy Adams, but it was in Garrison's Bennington paper that he first started to experiment with some of his abolitionist arguments. And he didn't have too much to say about Vermont afterwards. And to a certain extent, he gave contradictory reports. On the one hand, he said that he found that here abolitionism, as he said, was indigenous to the soil, that for whatever reason he found that Vermonters were receptive to these new abolitionist arguments, but at the same time he decided to move on to other things in Boston, and in a letter actually indicated, he said that he didn't care if he ever saw the Green Mountains again, that he hadn't made a whole lot of headway with his newspaper, and he was on to a wider market. But certainly, after Garrison left, abolitionism by the 30s and the 40s does become quite popular in Vermont, coexisting with colonization, right? And these two groups probably would have, certainly would have argued with each other about the future and the best means for ending slavery. So those are two of the early positions: colonization developing early in the 18 teens, then abolitionism in the 1830s. The third position, I would just call anti-slavery, or sometimes a free soil position, which really caught everybody in the middle. There's a broad spectrum of anti-slavery opinion in the North as well as in Vermont. So, anti-slavery men and women would be people who disliked slavery, right? Who wished to stop its spread, but perhaps doubted that it could be ended immediately, whether they had doubts about the constitutional issues involved or doubts about the transition that the freedmen would need from slavery to freedom. The biggest theme in kind of anti-slavery politics would be the politics of free soil. In other words, the idea that perhaps we didn't need to do anything about slavery where it existed in the South, but that committed individuals should oppose its expansion west into the territories. And this certainly was probably the most popular anti-slavery position in Vermont in the North. I mean, there's quite a bit of appeal in Vermont because, as you know from the previous lectures today, thousands of Vermonters were leaving the state in the antebellum era, heading west to find their fortunes. And there was quite a bit of fear that they would have to compete with a slave labor system in these large plantations. So this free soil position becomes very popular in Vermont, the idea that slavery should not be allowed to expand west. So this is sometimes what we call a moderate anti-slavery position. And it's this position that would best exemplify certainly Abraham Lincoln, right, who originally did not call for the immediate end of slavery, but wished to restrict its expansion. Horace Greeley, right, also falls into this camp. By the 1850s, he was very much a free soiler. He perhaps a bit more radical than Lincoln, but he didn't make the immediate end of slavery his immediate issue. And then, even Thaddeus Stevens, before the Civil War, did not believe that the federal government had the power constitutionally to end slavery in the South, but he certainly was on board with the Republican program of restricting its expansion. So it's the war, really, that pushes, first Stevens and Greeley, and then finally Lincoln, in a more radical direction. By arguing that, now that the war has begun, the free soil position can be abandoned and move more towards a direct abolitionist position. So we have, this gradation of opinion throughout the North and even in Vermont. And, and I could go on, of course, to other spectrums, because certainly in Vermont there was also what I guess we could term an anti-abolitionist position. There was certainly, not a majority, but there was a significant minority of Vermonters that didn't want to hear about the issue at all. That said agitating the slavery issue was endangering the Union, was endangering the country. This would have been a position that appealed especially to laboring men in cities like Rutland and Burlington, Irish immigrants, as I said, never a majority of Vermonters, but certainly a significant minority. So, so that brings me to the second myth that I want to address, and that is the assumption that Vermont was always an abolitionist state. Right? It wasn't. It was a state that, just like the rest of the country, was divided by the slave question, with advocates arguing all sides of the issue. Certainly it's true, as I said in the beginning, that Vermont, in the 1777 Constitution, enacted the first abolition law in the Western Hemisphere. Right? Vermont, not yet a state, but wrote into its Constitution a clause emancipating adult men and women. Just to read directly from it, Vermont's framers in the Constitution held that no one, quote, ought to be holden by law to serve any person as a servant, slave, or apprentice. So relatively clear-cut, but one of the most important books to come out on the issue in the last couple of years, it was written by Harvey Amani Whitfield, a professor at UVM, points out some serious shortcomings of that original Vermont abolition law that Vermonters don't often talk about. First of all, Vermont's abolition statute did not immediately grant freedom to anyone. Well, I should say everyone. It did immediately grant freedom to some, but not all. It only emancipated men who had reached the age of 21 and women who had reached the age of 18. So in 1777, children who were enslaved would remain enslaved until they reached either their 21st or their 18th birthday. So it was, this was quite typical. The other northern states mostly followed this pattern, that we would have a gradual emancipation, that not all people would be freed immediately. Secondly, the second shortcoming of the 1777 law is that we have quite a bit of evidence that Vermont's slave owners, Vermont's slave masters, were quick to test these loopholes in the law. There's an unknown number, a significant but unknown number of children that were sold out of the state before they'd reached their 18th or 21st birthday after the law was passed. So, in other words, some Vermont slave owners were choosing to sell, turn their slaves into cash assets before the law would have forced them to emancipate. Others tested the strength of the word ought in the Constitution. Right? I'll read the clause again. The direct words in the Constitution say, no one ought to be holden by law. which, if we have any lawyers in the crowd, that's not the strongest language that they could have chosen to use. And interestingly enough, there are records of Vermonters holding enslaved people beyond their 18th and 21st birthdays well into the 1790s, in fact, including judges and well-placed political figures who had been well aware of what the Constitution said. And there was one case in particular, Judge Stephen Jacobs of Windsor held a slave woman in his house in an ambiguous relationship. We don't know exactly how she was treated, but it was assumed anyway that she was serving him until 1802. And the reason it came to the court is because the townspeople were worried. They weren't outraged that there was possibly a slave in their town, the town of Windsor he's from. They were worried that she would become a town charge, that she, in other words, a pauper that the town would have to provide for, and so they sued Jacob to try to make him responsible for her maintenance into old age. But Jacob actually won the case on a technicality, even though the town produced a bill of sale by which Jacob had bought the woman after 1777. The judge ruled, well, since it was illegal to have a slave, therefore she could not have been a slave. And so Jacob was decided not, that he was not responsible for her upkeep. So, but what that story suggests to me is that in the early 1800s, anyway, there we can get a glimpse into kind of the colonizationist mind, the idea that slavery, we're not worried about slavery because it's a major evil, but we're worried about slavery because it, as African Americans transition to freedom, they could become a burden on the community, they could become a burden on the tax rolls. So I could imagine some of those citizens of Windsor might be sympathetic to colonization. Right? The solution would be to recolonize slaves. We have quite a bit of evidence that what we call outright abolitionists, as I said, faced a very controversial fight in Vermont in the antebellum years. The abolitionists never represented a majority of Vermont citizens. Certainly by the 1850s, there was an anti-slavery majority in Vermont. But as we remember, that doesn't mean that these were all abolitionists, right? They're anti-slavery thinkers of many stripes. Just to give you some evidence of the controversy with which abolitionist views were met. In 1835, for example, the abolitionist speaker Samuel J. May was harassed in Montpelier by a crowd that pelted him with rotten eggs and stones. They'd actually saved up their eggs to throw at this guy, unhappy about the abolitionist doctrines he was spreading throughout the state. We don't know who these crowds were. Probably people affiliated with the Democratic Party that would have been more friendly to the protection of slavery, but also probably others that were afraid that abolitionism would threaten the country's unity and survival. Frederick Douglass, right, the great African-American abolitionist, on a trip to Vermont, reported being greeted with racist language by some travelers on a stagecoach. In 1863, right in the midst of the Civil War, there was a draft riot here in Vermont in the marble quarries of West Rutland. A predominantly Irish working class group chased draft enrollers out of the town, refusing to sign up to have their names drawn for the war, many feeling that they did not want to fight or support what they would have called an abolition war. So even in Vermont, there was controversy during the war about the direction the Union was taking. And certainly if you read the letters of Vermont soldiers you'll encounter all kinds of opinions, but certainly the majority would have emphasized union over slavery in their letters home, that they were there to fight to preserve the union, and then some, yes, also to abolish slavery. But there's all kinds of examples. Just in my local research, Edward Hastings Ripley of Rutland wrote letters home very skeptical about emancipationist policies, and Abel Leavenworth, one of the great presidents at Castleton College, was one of the first Northern men into Richmond after the Confederate evacuation, and he was actually racing a group of African-American soldiers to get to the Capitol, and urged his men on that he would want the Vermonters to enter the city before the African-American unit. So all kinds of complicated relationships to slavery and quite an array of opinions about it. All right. Okay, so the last topic I want to address is, okay, well, what influenced then abolitionists, people who were out and out abolitionists? Why did they begin to adopt these positions? Well, the myth that I'd like to confront is the one that posits that religion was the main or only motivator of the abolitionist cause. And it's certainly, religion certainly plays a big role in the abolitionist movement. Vermont's churches, right, in particular, became meeting sites for abolitionist speakers. Right, this is where many Vermonters would have been exposed first to abolitionist ideology, both by speakers who used the meeting house to give lectures on abolitionist topics, as well as by ministers who were preaching to their congregations about the evils of slavery and the sinfulness of bondage. Vermont, like the rest of the country, even though it continued to have a significant Calvinist congregational background, was influenced by the Second Great Awakening that swept the country in the early 1800s, and that certainly influenced abolitionism. The Second Great Awakening rejected the old Calvinist doctrines of predestination, right? That God had decided man's fate before our birth, and instead preached that man had the power to save his or her own souls, and what's more, that man had the power to perfect human society. And in fact, once perfection on earth had been achieved, many believed that that might spark the second coming of Christ. So these Second Great Awakening doctrines were theologically hostile to slavery. First of all, the idea, the old Calvinist idea that God had established an order for the universe had been thrown out the window. The idea that some people might be predestined to be slaves. That was anathema to Second Great Awakening preachers. They believed slavery was a violation of man's individuality, right? That we all had an individual conscience, individual responsibility for our own souls. And secondly, these Second Great Awakening preachers believed that slavery might be an ill, or a problem that mankind could cure, could solve, could remove from the body politic. So religious doctrine certainly has a major impact on abolitionist thought in the antebellum era. But one thing that we're becoming increasingly aware of is that it's not the only influence on the abolitionists. Some of the most recent scholarship is exploring the ways in which thinking about the world, right? And global history influenced the abolitionists. In the years before the Civil War, Americans were quite proud of the American Revolution, of the Declaration of Independence, and they really believed that these ideologies would transform the world, that the future of the world belonged to representative government. And so in the years before the Civil War, Americans saw world history as a battle between the forces of representative democracy and aristocratic monarchy. Right? You know, in many ways, you can liken it to the Cold War of the 20th century, that the way to gain the freedom of the world would be to spread what they would have called, you know, representative or democratic institutions around the world. And so many thinkers saw, you know, say, the French Revolution, the European revolutions of 1848 as attempts to recreate what Americans had achieved here in the United States. So for thinkers along these lines, slavery represented a threat to those representative values. Slavery was an institution they believed that had come from the medieval era, that was part of the hierarchical, aristocratic, monarchical systems that had ruled the globe ever since. And in order to allow, say, American representative government to lead the world to a better era, slavery certainly would have to go by the wayside. So, you know, even William Lloyd Garrison, right, who was a committed Christian, no doubt about it, and was influenced in his abolitionism through his Christian beliefs, but even Garrison had these views. You know, his early work criticized monarchical government as much as it criticized slavery. He saw these as you know, two sides of the same coin, right? Countries governed by aristocrats and monarchs, very similar to regions and plantations governed by slaveholders. So, you know, I think it's really interesting to reflect that, you know, two of the most famous abolitionists with Vermont ties, right, Horace Greeley and Thaddeus Stevens, we talked about before, were not committed Christians. They both came at abolitionism from secular perspectives. Horace Greeley, right, who, as I said, not a native-born Vermonter, but got his start in publishing in Poultney, Vermont, in the late 1820s, became a widely ranging reformer in the years before the Civil War. He actually said that he had become introduced to anti-slavery positions during his time in Vermont. He actually reported seeing a crowd gather to rescue a fugitive slave who was destined to be returned to his master in another state, and he reported being very impressed by that. But in many ways, he was an unorthodox reformer who was up on all of the social philosophies of the day. When he went to New York and started publishing the Tribune, his first real passion was for utopian socialism. Some of the first socialist theories to emerge in the 19th century. He was a devotee of the Frenchman Charles Fourier, who imagined commune-like settlements would be the way forward, where owners of capital and workers would live together and share the profits. He also published Karl Marx in his paper. So he, in many ways, came to his anti-slavery through these new ways of thinking about the future of labor in the world of the 19th century, and saw slavery as anathema or backward. And of course, Greeley was also very much influenced by the free soil movement. He was an early promoter of the Homestead Act, right? The idea that you could solve urban poverty in the East by giving farms, right, for free to settlers who had moved west. And you can imagine why that was popular in Vermont with the large out-migration that we've talked about. And so Greeley believed slavery would interfere with those plans and make a Homestead Act impossible to achieve. And in many ways he was right. In the years before the war, it was primarily Southern senators and representatives that blocked homestead legislation in Congress, and it was one of the first pieces of legislation passed after the beginning of the Civil War. Thaddeus Stevens, right, another example. As I said, he grew up in Danville and Peacham before moving to Pennsylvania, where he launched his political career. But Stevens was a lifelong skeptic, right, hostile to organized religion. I mean, he certainly believed in a greater being, but did not necessarily heed organized religious doctrine. And what really motivated him throughout his career was opposition to hierarchy or aristocracy. This apparently began early in his career when he was a student at Dartmouth. He was very critical of fraternal organizations that he said were replicating aristocratic forms of social organization in the United States. And so he tended to see slavery as offering strength, right, to aristocratic slaveholders who ruled their plantations like lords. So when the war began, Stevens became by far the most outspoken advocate of striking at slavery, right, deprive, is what he called these aristocrats of the slaves that fueled the war and fueled their wealth and riches. So, and as you know, Stevens was instrumental in pushing for first the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, and then the 14th Amendment that established citizenship rights for all Americans in this country. So, how to conclude? What do we make of this review? Well, first of all, it's clear, obviously, that Vermont and Vermonters did play a big role in agitating the slave question that brought on the Civil War and pushing for its outcome. They agitated the issue with their petitions that led to the political fights of the 1830s and 40s. Without these figures with Vermont ties, as I've said, the 13th and 14th Amendments would have possibly been more difficult to pass. Still, it's important to remember that their work was controversial, right, in their home state, as well as controversial around the nation. The way I look at the war is that we need to plot political sentiment on a spectrum, right? The issues of slavery divided the whole country, not just northern states and southern states, but within these states there would have been spectrums of opinion, where in a place like Vermont, anti-slavery would be the majority. There would also be an anti-abolitionist minority, and as you move further south, that situation would be flipped, right? The difference is, right, that the war begins when states with a majority pro-slavery position in the South found the idea intolerable that an anti-slavery president, right, would take office. And so for that reason, the slave question, as Abraham Lincoln said, undoubtedly somehow caused the war, but as the war broke out, the first question on everyone's mind, including in Vermont, was union versus disunion. And as the war unfolded, it pushed many Americans in Vermont and elsewhere towards an abolitionist position that had been well established, right, by the work of these Vermont abolitionists and others throughout the antebellum era. So, thanks very much.
Small but enthusiastic audience.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to talk, entertain questions.
On a much broader issue, how did you choose the Civil War for your focus?
No, that's a great question. Well, I I trace it back to when I was an adolescent. There were a number of major events that directed my attention to the Civil War. The first was Ken Burns' 10-part series, The Civil War, which I remember seeing when it first came out. The second was the movie Glory, which was kind of the first R-rated movie I saw in theaters. Yeah, so this is about the exact same time as Ken Burns. And then third, I visited Gettysburg with my family at about that time, and so I became quite interested in the Civil War. But as far as getting into it in graduate school, I knew that I wanted to study history, but I think really what attracted me about the Civil War era is that it felt historical in a way that the 20th century didn't. In other words, you're reading people's letters, you're reading their diaries, and these are people that you really have to work to get inside their heads, right? They're not modern people, and so that excited me.
And what did you write your dissertation about?
Well, my dissertation was about Europeans and European revolutions and their impact on the Civil War. So I gave a little bit of what I talk about there, and thinking about the global dimensions of the war and global dimensions of abolitionism. And that then eventually became my book, The Revolution of 1861. It's called. I was thinking that, I don't know if you were here for the previous lecture, but it would have dovetailed nicely because he was talking about Vermont as this borderland and crossing between Canada. So I did do some work on the Irish and the Fenians and things like that.
Oh, they're post-Civil War.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say in '59 when John Brown did his Harper's Ferry attack, which of course was very galvanizing and
absolutely
divisive. Did you come across anything how Vermont as a state respond to that?
Yeah, again, complicated. Obviously there was support for Brown in Vermont, but there's also an episode in Burlington, I believe, in which a preacher who got up and defended John Brown was then forced to resign his post. So there certainly would have been Vermonters that saw even if they were anti-slavery, who saw his actions as unhelpful or criminal, perhaps as well. Yeah, so it's, that's what's interesting about this subject. I haven't done, it's not my area of extensive research, but, I've mostly just been doing some reading, and we need to know more about it because it's not as clear-cut as it seems. There's a broad spectrum of opinion, as I said, and it would be interesting to see kind of a breakdown of, how Vermont as a whole responded to John Brown.
When you mentioned the draft riots in '62, right?
Yeah.
Was that the same time that the New York draft riots?
Yeah.
It was in
it was
response
after,
to Lincoln's, So, as you were saying, I was curious, it's like, did the ones down in 5 points and the ones up here, did they happen simultaneously, unrelatedly, or did the Vermonters hear what was going down in New York?
Great question.
Yeah.
I would say probably a little of each. I mean, on the one, it's not that it was organized together, but certainly they were aware of the opposition that was going on in the rest of the country. It's another interesting episode that happened there in West Rutland.
How did the Vermont regiments equip themselves during the war?
Oh, I mean, the Vermont, some of the legendary fighting regiments, right? The Vermont Brigade was
always the 20th Maine.
Yeah, well, yeah, I would think so. The 20th Maine is they did wonders for its reputation with the movie Gettysburg. Yeah, but the interesting thing is that, and I mean they should. I mean it's true that they were the regiments at the very end of the line at Gettysburg, but there are many other regiments there that were defending Little Round Top. It wasn't just the 20th Maine. No Vermont regiments playing a big role there, but certainly there was a Vermont regiment that helped repulse Pickett's charge, right, at Gettysburg.
Oh, they did like a cross fire. Yeah.
Yep.
What regiment was it?
Well, let's see. That was Stannard's Brigade. It was a 9-month regiment. I can't remember the exact number. Somebody might know it, but yeah, they were a 9-month group, so they weren't part of the famous Vermont Brigade, but
And whether they were sort of positioned to the side, if I remember, so that they were shooting right across the
they were in line.
charge.
They were in line on Cemetery Ridge, and then their officer ordered them to swing out into the field and kind of fire into the side of the charge. But Battle of the Wilderness in Spotsylvania, that's where the Vermont Brigade really, it was a bad day for Vermont. Obviously, they were right in the middle of the fight, helping to kind of hold the plank road, and then Cedar Creek, obviously, in 1864, one of the Vermont regiments was instrumental in kind of stemming the Confederate onslaught and then allowing the Union to rally. And of course, up in Montpelier, we still have the Cedar Creek Room in honor of that. But, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all for coming.